One of the reasons for writing my book was to make available data from a study I'd done on pilot fatigue. Most airlines have some sort of control system in place, be it flight time limitations or a fatigue risk management system. But they don't really measure the endemic level of fatigue borne by pilots. That's what I was interested in. I wanted to use a measure that was recognised, had published cut-off values, and if possible had been used in other studies inside airlines. There's only one that ticks those boxes. It's something called the Fatigue Severity Scale. About 350 of my colleagues completed the form, and what I found was about 70% of them would be assessed as fatigued on that scale. What did that tell me? If you look at the few studies that have been done amongst the general population, about 40% of people would be assessed as fatigued at any time. So yeah, we've got a higher percentage of tired people amongst the pilot group. But that still really doesn't tell me much. I needed another way of segmenting my population. The next step was to apply something called the Oldenburg Burnout Inventory, the OLBI, to another sample of pilots who also completed the FSS. The OLBI was used by the British Airline Pilots Association in a large-scale study of burnout amongst pilots, so it has a bit of a track record in aviation. I included in my sample a number of management pilots who, because of their reduced flying roster, I assumed were likely to be less tired than the average line pilot. What I found from the OLBI was that, sure enough, I had a group of relatively rested pilots. I then had a group of pilots who would count as being burnt out on that scale. And then I had a larger group of intermediate pilots, shall we say. I then took the average FSS score for each of those three groups, and that gave me another set of cut-off values that I could apply to my original larger survey. And that's where things started to get interesting. We've ended up with three groups. About 20% of pilots have the properties of being rested. 35% of pilots clearly are at risk of burnout, and the middle group, 45%, occupy a space that is neither rested nor not yet burnt out. Where it became even more interesting is when I then looked at some of the other measures that I'd taken. So, for example, need for recovery, sleep quality, work-life balance, how people cope with fatigue using medication and alcohol, and then what are the implications for physical and mental well-being. All of the data is reported in chapter 4 of the book. I think you'll find it interesting.